Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Your Neighbor on the Left podcast. I'm your host, Don Spieles. Let me apologize right off the bat. I'm getting over a bout of bronchitis, so my voice isn't exactly up to 100%, but I was chomping at the bit to get started on this project, and I couldn't wait any longer. A couple disclaimers. This is my first podcast. I've never done any podcast before. This is my first go at it, and I'm hoping that you'll all enjoy it. I'll get better as I go, I'm sure, but the way I foresee it coming out is in the following way. We're going to do weekly episodes. We're going to split those episodes into a section on hot topics, things from the news that have caught my attention, and then also a deep dive segment where we take maybe one of those ideas from the hot topics, maybe a different topic altogether, and delve into it a little bit more. I'll try to end each podcast with a little bit of information about what might be coming up in the following podcast, and hopefully keep you all engaged as much as possible. One more disclaimer. I will do my best to be fair and balanced, wink wink, but I'm not going to hide the fact that I am definitely on the liberal side of things, as you might have taken from the title of the podcast. I want this podcast to feature a perspective of a person who has liberal progressive views and lives in an area where it's predominantly conservative, at least as far as my neighbors and friends and so on are concerned. I don't plan on attacking anybody. I don't plan on disparaging people, generally speaking, but I'm not going to say things that I don't think are true or things that I don't believe in simply because I'm trying to make everyone happy. If your first question when you hear me say this is, why am I a liberal? Why do I believe the way I do? Well, that's going to be the subject of this first episode's deep dive. So bear with me and we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so with that little bit of upfront business done and over with, let's go into our hot topics for the week. The first of which is the 5051 movement and the protests associated with that movement. As I record this episode, it is April 19th, and today was another day of national protests organized by the 5051 movement. If you're not familiar with the 5051 movement, the name sort of says it all. 5051, 50 protests, 50 states, one day. It actually ends up being a bit of a misnomer because the movement has become so popular that there are many more than 50 protests on the days that this group organizes them. For instance, today I know of two in driving distance from me. There was one scheduled for Bloomsburg, PA, and one scheduled at the state capitol. And they were organized. This is the second one we've had in April. We had one on April 5th as well. I say one, but I mean many, across the country with thousands upon thousands of people coming out and peacefully protesting. Now, the question of what they're protesting, the high-altitude view of these protests are that they are protesting the current administration and the myriad of things that happen on a daily basis that people disagree with who think like I think. And those things can be the liquidation of federal employees, the challenges to the Constitution, civil rights violations that the administration seems to be behind. But I guess the point of these demonstrations is that they coalesce a group of people, and not every single person in that group may have the same thing in their head as they're doing this protest. If you look at these protest videos, you will see that there are many different signs and many different people who are out there to show their support for causes they believe in and against causes that they don't align with, but they all fall under the same overarching umbrella of things that our current president and our current presidential administration are seemingly working against. Now, the reaction of the right to these protests, as with any protests that have come up in the past, 8 or 10 years, the first reaction that I always see on social media is that the protesters are paid. These protesters are being paid to come out and protest, and they don't really care about the issue, but they're getting money. And usually it's George Soros is the one who is identified as the payer. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the craziness of that contention. We live in an age where there is no shortage of information. Not all of it is accurate, obviously, but there is no shortage of information out there, no shortage of ways to get insight into various things. And the question that always comes to my mind when I hear someone talk about how these protests are paid is, how are these people being recruited? If there was someone out there who was offering money for protesters to come and get paid for their time, you would think that there would be evidence. There would be a paper trail that somebody would have found. There would have been social media posts about how you can get involved and get your check, or what the process is for monetizing this protesting that people are doing. And the fact that while so many people will go on social media and say, paid protesters, no one ever seems to be able to come back and show anything that would lead you to believe that this is how the protesters get paid, or this is how the protesters are recruited. So this leads then into my next thought, is that what is the point of talking heads on the right saying that protesters are paid? Well, it seems sort of obvious. The idea that you attribute somebody's protesting to their being rewarded monetarily takes away the validity of the protest. It's not true outrage. It's not true rejection of something or protest against something. It's just a money-making scheme. And the people who have the money and agree with the topics of the protesters, they're the ones who are pulling the strings. But it's the rank and file who are marching down the street with their signs. They don't really care. They're just out there because they're getting a paycheck. And a couple observations that stem from this. The first one is that this seems to be a clear way to avoid the actual conversation. Instead of having to have a report on, say, Fox or Newsmax about what the protesters are upset about and whether or not their causes or their concerns are valid or any of that, instead, the conversation is turned to, oh, they're paid, and it's a conspiracy, and it's disingenuous at best, fraudulent at worst. The irony of this is that the folks who are putting this theory forward the most are paid. They're paid whether they are conservative content makers for social media, they are conservative personalities on the TV shows on the networks that I mentioned, and they have every right to be paid. That's their job. That's what they're doing. And, folks tune in and the sponsors pay for these shows, and that's the way it's supposed to work. But it just seems sort of odd that the folks who are getting paid to say the talking points and the news for the right are then trying to cast doubt against the protesters by saying that they're paid, and somehow equating being paid with not being genuine. But that's sort of besides the point, because, as I said, there is zero credible evidence that there are payments going out for these protesters. Now, and you'll hear, or you'll see comments on social media with pictures or videos that say, look, they're busing them in. Look, all these people got off the bus. Who paid for the bus? Well, I mean, if you're protesting in a place like Washington, D.C., or a big city, New York, whatever, yes, you're going to bus in. If 100,000 protesters show up in 80,000 vehicles, you can imagine the problems that causes. So, yeah, people take buses. Doesn't necessarily offer evidence that the buses are sponsored by anybody. But again, no one ever has anything other than the theory to say that someone is doing this, and I would welcome anyone who is able to show me something that they've found that leads them to believe that there is recruitment or there is some sort of organized payment process for folks going to protests. If nothing else, I'd like to get in on it. I could always use the extra money. But again, the point of it all is that saying they're paid is a tactic to pull away credibility from the protest. And it diverts from the real conversation about the things that are being protested. This seems like as good a time as any to mention that if you want to send in comments or questions about the things that I'm discussing, you can shoot me an email at neighboroutleftpodcast@gmail.com. That's neighboroutleftpodcast, all lowercase, no spaces, @gmail.com. I would love to hear what you have to say about any of the things that I have to say. So the next topic that I wanted to cover in this first podcast that's been getting talked about quite a bit in the last week or so is the conflict between President Trump and the courts. The main topic of that, of course, has been the issue with the gentleman from Maryland who was deported and sent to the prison in El Salvador. But there's an overarching theme here so far in this second term of President Trump that he's not particularly akin to listening to what the courts have to say. When a court rules against him, he comes out and he says that they are radical and that they have their own agenda and they're politicized. And there have been dozens of articles out there over the first 80-some days of his second term here that show that the judges who have ruled against him have been appointed by multiple different presidents, some by Bush, some by Obama, some by Trump himself, and it starts to take away a lot of the credibility from the basic argument that they just don't agree with him ideologically, so they're trying to punish him. But the bigger issue, from my perspective, seems to be that there's an argument out there that some people are making that the judges don't have the authority to do what they're doing. And from my perspective, that is dead wrong. And this goes back to 8th grade civics class, if you can remember back that far, and the concept of checks and balances. There is a wonderfully simple and detailed diagram that's out there, probably from one of those 8th grade civics textbooks, that explains how checks and balances work, and I will try and post it to the podcast social media pages. But basically what it describes is that it shows a two-way relationship between each of the three branches of government with the other branches. So, for instance, whereas Congress makes laws and allocates funds, the president has the power to veto legislation that they send him. The veto isn't used all that often, but it is at the president's disposal if he chooses to do so, if the law that is passed by Congress, for whatever reason, he doesn't believe should be enacted. Once he vetoes that legislation, it goes back to Congress, and if they really feel strongly about it, they can override the veto, but in that case, they need a 75% majority, a 3/4 majority, in order to override the veto. If you look at the relationship between Congress and the court, the Supreme Court rules on legislation that's passed by the Congress. They are there to determine whether or not the law that was passed conforms with the Constitution and should be followed or should be overturned. The reciprocal relationship there is that Congress confirms judicial appointments. When a judge is being nominated for a particular spot in a particular section of the federal court system, all the way up to the Supreme Court, it's Congress that sits down and holds a hearing and questions these candidates, these nominees, to decide whether or not they seem to be appropriate for the position that they're being nominated for. And then, thirdly, you have the relationship between the president and the court. The president is the one who appoints these judges. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. President Trump was able to put several judges on the Supreme Court during his first term. He nominates them. Then Congress has their confirmation hearings. And in the case of Trump's nominees, they all passed muster and they all made it to the Supreme Court. At least the Supreme Court nominees all made it. But the reverse of that, him appointing judges, or the president appointing judges, the check on that power is that then the Supreme Court has the ability or the power to rule on executive actions. That's the whole point of this checks and balances system that was set up by the Constitution. And just because a ruling doesn't please the executive branch doesn't mean that the judiciary is acting above their purview. This is exactly how it's supposed to work. And if you don't agree with the ruling, then you can appeal the ruling. You take it to court. Eventually, if it's a strong enough case or a strong enough argument, it works its way up to the Supreme Court, who is the final say on that issue. Now, breaking this down into all the different cases and all the different rulings that have happened in the last 80-some days, I mean, that could be a deep dive in and of itself, and it's not what we're going to do today, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about that checks and balances thing. It makes me wonder how much folks remember about middle school and civics and history classes and the things that they taught us, because the things that I see out there on social media lead me to believe that there's a lot of folks who really don't have their hands around the concept of the way the three branches of government work together or are supposed to work together. And that topic dovetails nicely into my third hot topic for this episode, is the concept of executive overreach. Now, what do I mean by executive overreach? What I'm talking about is that so much of what has been done since Donald Trump was sworn in on January 20th has been outside of the purview of Congress. It's been an onslaught of executive orders. And so far, if I'm not mistaken, since January 20th, only 5 bills have been signed into law. And by that I mean they were voted on by the Senate, voted on by the House, passed and sent to the president's desk for signature. 5 different laws. Now, to put that in perspective, at this point back in 2017, Trump had already signed 24 bills into law. 24 bills that had gone through both houses and landed on his desk. By this point in Joe Biden's presidency, he had signed 7 bills into law. In 2009, President Obama had signed 11 bills into law by this point. In 2001, George Bush had signed 7 bills into law. And if we go all the way back to 1993, by this stage of the presidency, he had signed 21 bills into law. These are all bills, again, that had come through the normal channels and ended up on his desk. The idea that right now we've only had 5 of them come across his desk in the normal channels, while in and of itself it's not an emergency, but when you think about the massive amount of things that he's undertaken that have been done outside of the normal process for a bill to be resolved and signed into law, the massive number of executive orders, and some of them have been nonsense, some of them have been the Gulf of America, and some of them have been things like English as the national language, which, if any of you have seen any of my previous social media posts, English as the national language is a joke. People have told me that, well, if we make English the national language, then folks who come to live here from other countries will be more likely to learn the language. And I think that that's patently false. If you come here as an immigrant and you are deciding whether or not you're going to learn the language, the reasons why you decide to do it or not to do it aren't going to be changed by the idea that there's an executive order that says that English is our national language. If you can't afford it, if you don't have time to take the classes because you're working, if you're just somebody who doesn't have the aptitude to learn a new language, there are a myriad of reasons why you might not dive into learning the English language when you come to the United States. The idea that there's an executive order that says English is the national language has very little bearing on that from what I can see. Now, getting back to those 5 bills that were signed into law, the other thing to keep in mind is that right now, President Trump has both of the branches of Congress on his side. The Senate and the House are both Republican majority. You would think that it would be the optimum time to start putting some legislation through, because who knows, after the midterm elections next year, he may not have both of them, God willing. But the idea that it's been such a minimal event so far seems telling, and this lends credence to the folks that, like me, who see one of the goals of this presidency is to maximize the power of the executive branch as much as possible. And so far, he's done a lot of things without Congress. At last count, 124 executive orders so far, 33 memoranda, and another 33 proclamations that had nothing to do with congressional oversight. This veritable avalanche of paperwork that the Trump White House has put through that arguably usurps Congress's authority over federal programs and personnel is a big deal. And it's not an accident as far as I can tell. I believe that this is the goal. And this deals with cutting funds to federal agencies, firing federal employees, all of the things that have made the headlines under Doge. These are all things that would normally be considered something that had to go through Congress for spending. Congress is supposed to be the purse, and all of these executive orders are sidestepping that, which is what a lot of the lawsuits have to do with from the previous point, where judges are siding against the White House. And as long as we're on the subject of potential overreach by the executive branch, this brings me to the last hot topic of the episode, and that has to do with the threats that the president has made specifically against Harvard University, threatening them to have the IRS take away their tax-exempt status if they don't toe the line. Now, if there's anybody out there who hasn't heard this story, which seems unlikely, the Trump administration sent a letter to Harvard University accusing them of not living up to their educational and moral standards and preventing or battling against anti-Semitism, and that if they didn't straighten out and fly right, the IRS would revoke their tax-exempt status. Actually, let me rephrase that. It wasn't just anti-Semitism claims that the administration had problems with. The letter that they sent had a laundry list of things they wanted Harvard to deal with their supposed anti-Semitism bias, but they also are insisting on their discontinuation of DEI initiatives. They want a revamped student discipline reform and accountability procedure, and protections for whistleblowers and better transparency and monitoring. And the letter was about 5 pages long, but the point was that if they didn't do what the administration wanted them to do, they were going to lose their federal funding, which is over $2 billion, and that they are at risk of losing their tax-exempt status from the IRS. Now, it's the second of those that I wanted to focus on, the tax-exempt status, because back under the Obama administration, there were issues where the IRS was supposedly targeting religious organizations and their tax-exempt status. And in a recent interview in the Oval Office, President Trump was asked why, if the IRS going after those groups was different than the IRS going after Harvard.
In the first term, your Attorney General apologized to Tea Party groups who have been targeted by the IRS under the Obama administration. Why is it okay for the IRS to now be looking at changing the tax status of Harvard because of policy disagreements you have with the university?
Okay, so the question then that we got there was, if the Obama administration targeted these groups, why is that different than what he's doing to Harvard? And the first thing you're going to hear is a very Trumpian story about the wonderful conversation that he had with some of these folks who he claims were targeted.
So, I had dinner last night with a lot of pastors and ministers and people of faith, and there were like 32 of them, and it was beautiful in the Blue Room, and they said, "Sir, I was targeted by the IRS, and the FBI came in, sir, and I've been going through hell for years." And not only that, we're also finding that many people just having to do with Trump support have gone through hell. And they've used the IRS for purposes of something that's very illegal for them to have to do.
Were you trying to
it's a very, very illegal thing to do what they did. And I think it's such a shame. That was long what?
Okay, so now here's where the rubber really hits the road. You heard the president say that targeting groups based on ideology was a very, very illegal thing to do, and that it shouldn't be done. So the reporter who asked the initial question then follows up with the question again as to, if that's the case, why is what he's threatening to do to Harvard okay? And this is the exchange.
If that was wrong, why are you considering changing the tax status of Harvard?
Because I think Harvard's a disgrace. I think what they did was a disgrace. They're obviously anti-Semitic, and all of a sudden they're starting to behave. But when you see what they were saying, what they were doing, when you see the way they took care of events, when you watch that woman, that horrendous president that ruined the image of Harvard, maybe permanently, in Congress, in the halls of Congress. When you take a look at what happened there, it was horrific. And, I've looked at a lot having to do with it. I'm not involved in it. It's being handled by lawyers. I read about it just like you did. But tax-exempt status, it's a privilege. It's really a privilege, and it's been abused.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there. He mentions that horrible woman who spoke to Congress. We assume that who he's talking about is Claudine Gay, the former president of Harvard, who testified before Congress in 2023 about anti-Semitism and Harvard's role in preventing it or proliferating it. She's no longer at Harvard anymore. She resigned shortly after that testimony she gave to Congress, and Harvard has a new president. Another thing you heard the president say in that clip was that although he's looking into it quite a bit, he has nothing to do with it. It's lawyers who are dealing with it, which is just, classic Trump double talk when he's ad-libbing in front of reporters. But the key thing here is that he will talk about how targeting by the IRS is a horribly illegal thing to do, but it's not horribly illegal in this case because in this case, he doesn't agree with the people that they're targeting, the people that they targeted under Obama. And that's a whole nother story because after those allegations were made, subsequent investigations found that when the IRS was vetting tax-exempt status for various groups, they were looking for both conservative and liberal biases in the organizations that they gave tax-exempt status to. But that's a little too much to get into at this particular moment. The key thing here is that the groups that he's talking about who were targeted under the Obama administration are groups that support him. And what he's talking about with Harvard is a university, and universities, generally speaking, have been under attack, not just recently, but more so recently, because of their supposed liberal biases. And in that category, they are not someone who Trump considers a fan. So that seems to be the litmus test. If you like him, then you're not allowed to be targeted by the IRS. But if you don't like him, or if he doesn't like you, then targeting by the IRS is fine. And if doing this wasn't ridiculous on its face, it's made all the more exasperating by the idea that when President Trump was campaigning for this recent election, and certainly since then, through the voice of Vice President J.D. Vance, all we hear about is how free speech is paramount, and this administration is going to return free speech to America, and everyone's going to be able to revel in it again. But apparently it's free speech with an asterisk next to it, because it's free speech when it's speech that they like. So for this deep dive in the first podcast, I thought it might be a good idea to give you some idea of who it is that you're listening to, a little bit about me, where I've come from, why I think the way I do, some details on what I think, why I'm doing this podcast, and what you might expect in a little bit more in-depth way from what will be coming in the future episodes of this podcast. So let's start off with the basics. As I sit and record this, I'm a 54-year-old Caucasian male who hails from central Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small town that isn't even there anymore, one that many of you may have heard of, Centralia, Pennsylvania. Centralia is the town famous for its mine fire, and I lived in Centralia up until the time I was 15 years old, at which point my family had decided to move. I was raised Roman Catholic. I went to Catholic school for 12 years. I am one of 2 siblings. I have a younger sister. I was raised by 2 Democrat parents, both working class folks. My father worked for all of the years I knew him in a factory, and my mother was a postal worker. I recently had one of my cousins comment on a Facebook post of mine and insinuating that my parents had voted for Reagan. Now, while I certainly wouldn't testify on a stack of Bibles, my memories do not match his. I remember my parents being very vocal about their being Democrats. I remember specifically my father being really turned off by Ronald Reagan, and maybe not even so much because of his policies, though I'm sure that had something to do with it, but my father just didn't like him because he was an actor, and he thought everything he did was an act, and as such was the worst type of politician. All of the adults that I had exposure to growing up where I did were working class folks. At least that was my impression of them. I didn't know any doctors except for the one that I went to when I had a cold. I didn't know any lawyers. I certainly didn't know any wealthy people, as I understand the term today, the term wealthy. Everyone worked with their hands, and it was a very close-knit community, as you might expect. Like I said, I went to Catholic school for 12 years. Catholic school with nuns and rulers, and I was an altar boy at the local parish, and I basically lived in the version of the 70s and 80s that you see in all the social media memes where kids spent all their time outside, didn't come in the house unless they were absolutely forced to, and somehow we all survived. Now, I couldn't sit here and say to you that this particular thing from my childhood or that particular thing from my childhood are the reasons why I think the way I think, particularly about politics and social issues. I don't think I thought on that level until I got to college. And for the sake of being totally honest, when I was in college, the first and only group I joined while I was at college was the Young Republicans. I was a political science major mostly because the subject interested me. I always liked history, so I ended up with a bachelor's degree in poli-sci and a minor in history after 4 years at Bloomsburg University. But when I first got there, I had a friend who was a big Republican, or so he said, and I joined the group with him. And that was my first introduction to the meat and potatoes of a lot of the political issues, at least what the political issues were in those years between 89 and 94 while I was there. After graduating, I ended up just sort of falling into a position with the county that I lived in, specifically for human services with that county, and even more specifically, what was then called the Office of Mental Health and Mental Retardation. Since then, it has been renamed for political correctness purposes as Behavioral Health and Intellectual Disabilities. And just coincidentally, the way it was set up in the county where I worked, the Office of Substance Abuse Programs was also under that same umbrella. I spent 25 years working for that organization in various different jobs and got a lot of experience meeting and dealing with folks with mental illness, intellectual disabilities, and substance abuse issues. I spent several years as a crisis worker, being the one who got the call in the middle of the night when there was a person in crisis, and either talking to them on the phone or going out to where they were and dealing with the myriad of things that those situations can entail. I could honestly probably do a podcast just on the stories from my days as a crisis worker, because there are so many and they are so unbelievable. At least many of them are, but that's a different topic. One thing I can tell you about working as a social worker is that the stereotypes are definitely true. Social workers are horribly overworked, criminally underpaid, and very much underappreciated, except for by the people that they serve, and maybe even in some cases by those people as well. But after 25 years of working for the county, I lucked into the position that I have now. I work for a private provider who does services specifically with folks with intellectual disabilities and autism, and it's the best job I've ever had. I get to work from home, and I wouldn't trade it in for all the tea in China. But the point of that, I guess, is if you have to point a finger at something, some experience that has led me to be the person that I am and have the beliefs that I do, it's those years that I spent working in that field. So, what is it that I believe? What is it, my mindset, that has come from those years and whatever other influences, conscious or unconscious, that I've had? As I said at the beginning of this episode, there's no other way to describe me as liberal. And I'm as woke as they come. And I don't consider that an insult. I consider that a compliment, no matter how it's slung at me. But to be more specific, I'm a firm believer that every person, no matter of their race or their gender or their religion, their sexual orientation, their income, whatever other social stratification you can name, I believe that everyone deserves equal rights, opportunities, dignity, respect, tolerance. I believe the primary role of government, particularly in this country, is supposed to be that it plays a role in making life better for ordinary people. That's by funding education, healthcare, clean energy, public safety nets like Social Security, Medicare, unemployment benefits, the whole deal. There's a somewhat famous quote from Ronald Reagan that goes something like this: "The most terrifying 11 words in the English language are, 'Hello, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help you.'" Now, while that may be true because of the way our government actually functions, I don't believe it should be true. And in terms of what I'd like to see in government, they are things that go towards the end of making that sentence false. I'm a firm believer in voting rights should be protected. I am not a fan of this new SAVE Act that is going through Congress right now, and we'll probably touch on that in a later episode in more detail, but I definitely think that the government should do everything it can to help people vote, not hinder them from voting. I grew up in a family of hunters. My father and my uncles all hunted. One of my sons still hunts, though I don't anymore for various reasons. But even though I own some firearms, I am a proponent of common sense gun law reform. And the main reason for that is because while all the Second Amendment fans on the right will tell you that getting rid of guns won't solve the problems that we have, they don't ever offer an answer as to what will. So until I get a better answer, I'm sticking with the one that makes the most sense, the one that's the most logical. This is another topic I'm sure we'll delve into in later episodes. I am personally not a fan of abortion, but I'm even less of a fan of government interference in women's health care. I think that decisions about such a thing are best made by a woman and her physician, and that the ramifications of that are between her and what she sees as her higher power. I don't believe that making abortions illegal does much to provide for less abortions. It makes way for much more dangerous abortions and risking the lives of women who are forced to take these other options. Now, I realize as I say this, I'm simplifying the issue and the arguments down, but again, I'm just trying to give everyone who's listening an idea of where my head is at as I progress with the podcast that hopefully you'll keep on listening to. I'm a fan of labor unions, even though the one I had when I was a worker when I was a social worker, that union sucked terribly. But in the big picture, I believe that unions are a thing that needs to happen, or that we need to have, and I am really disheartened at the idea that so much of the right and particularly the current administration seem to be very much willing to diminish the role of unions in the country, and by proxy are attacking the rights of workers. And then that brings us to the biggest hot button topic of these days is immigration. I am not a fan of free and totally open borders and wholesale immigration without any sort of rules or regulations. I know that that's the way liberals like myself are often painted, but that is not the case. What I'm in favor of, I think, would best be described as compassionate immigration. The narrative that's pushed by the right, particularly by the president, that the majority of the people who are coming into our country from other places are criminals and deviants and mentally ill people and every other sort of miscreant that you could imagine, is a patently false narrative. There is literally no empirical evidence that should lead anyone to believe that the immigrant population has any more criminals in it than the Caucasian population does. In fact, the statistics that you will find, if you're looking for the real statistics, will tell you just the opposite, that violent crime is far less common in immigrant populations than it is in groups made up of natural-born Americans. And the biggest thing these days that keeps getting talked about, but yet no one really seems to understand it when they're not a fan of immigration is the due process argument. If you're deporting somebody, you are giving them due process. It's part of the deportation process. Without due process, it's not deportation. This is definitely a subject that I'll be talking about more as we go on. I read this quote. I don't know if I should call it a quote because no one seems to know who was the one who first said it, but it goes something like this. The major difference between a liberal and a conservative is something like this. A liberal would rather feed 100 people on the chance that just one of them is actually starving, whereas a conservative would let 100 people go hungry on the chance that one of those people is running a scam. And I realize that oversimplifies it. But if you think about it and you look at some of the policies and you look at some of the populations that are targeted and the things that are said, you can't help but admit that there's a nugget of truth in that axiom. So what this has been is a very high altitude view of where it is that my mindset is in terms of politics and culture and current events. If you are willing to grace me with your audience as we go through the episodes of this podcast, you'll get much more details on the things I think and the ways I view the world. But I wanted to end this podcast by just talking a little bit about why I'm doing the podcast. I normally limit my political activity to discussions on social media with friends and or strangers, and posting stories that I find relevant in one way or another to the goings on. And recently on one of my posts, a former coworker of mine made a comment that I should start a podcast and talk more in depth about the things that I post and the ideas that I have. And at first I just sort of laughed it off, but I started to think about it, and I started to do some research and see not only how easy it can be to do a podcast, but the potential audience for such a thing for a very minimal investment of time and resources. And as I started to ponder how I would go about this, what exactly would the podcast be, I thought of the people around me in my neighborhood and my community and my county and my state. And while Pennsylvania isn't as red as many other states, the area I live in is very rural, and I am definitely in the minority as far as my political views. And most of the people around me who know me, I'm not one of those folks who's accosted by MAGA folks and berated and chastised and so on and so forth. I once in a while I'll hear things, but I wanted to do this podcast to give the folks around me, and maybe folks in a broader area who are in similar types of settings, an idea of what a rural liberal person is like, why we think the way we think, what we think specifically, sort of filter out all of the pablum that you get from all the places that like to describe liberals in a nutshell, and often not in a positive way. So as I go through these episodes, that's where my brain is at. I'm trying to think about the topics and the way I discuss them as though I was sitting and having a conversation with somebody I know who doesn't agree with the things that I think. And hopefully maybe at some point as the podcast goes on and I get some more experience and a little bit more technical know-how, I really like to be able to bring people in and have actual conversations with them on the podcast. And that I'm really looking forward to. I really hope that comes to be. Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of this first episode. I'd like to thank anyone who is listening for taking the time to join me and hear the things I have to say. I hope that you will download the next episode. And by way of a teaser, one of the things that I'd like to talk about more in the next episode is the subject of RFK and Health and Human Services, and his recent remarks about autism, and just some general information about what's going on in that area. Of course, I'll leave the hot topics up to the daily headlines between now and then, see what grabs my attention and hopefully will grab your attention. So So for today, thank you very much for listening once again. Again, my name is Don Spieles, and this has been the Your Neighbor on the Left podcast.